Imagine a secret so explosive it could topple a nation in a single day. A general, armed with foreign promises and a briefcase full of betrayal, thought he could steal a country's future. But what happens when one man's integrity faces the... Welcome to Code of Line, where we unravel the untold stories that shape our world. From epic battles of truth to game-changing revelations, we bring you stories that inspire, shock, and ignite your passion. In the heart of West Africa, where the red dust of the Sahel meets the ambitions of powerful men, a story unfolded that shook the very foundations of political power. This is a tale of President Ibrahim Traoré, a man whose quiet strength will be tested by one of the most audacious betrayals in modern African politics. A decorated general, drunk on foreign promises and personal ambition, believed he could simply walk into the presidential palace and claim power like a prize. He had documents. He had backing. He had weapons. But what he didn't have was the one thing that would ultimately destroy him: the respect of his own people. What you're about to witness is not just a political thriller, but a masterclass in how true leadership responds when faced with treachery. The question isn't whether good will triumph over evil. It's how spectacularly evil will crumble when confronted with unwavering integrity. The morning sun cast long shadows across the red earth of Ouagadougou. As the city slowly awakened, it was about to face one of the most extraordinary days in Burkina Faso's tumultuous political history. The air carried that peculiar stillness that often precedes momentous events, as if the very atmosphere were holding its breath in anticipation. Inside the modest presidential palace, a structure that deliberately eschewed the grandiose displays of power favored by so many African leaders, President Ibrahim Traoré sat in his Spartan office, surrounded by books rather than gold, maps rather than portraits of himself. At 34, he was among the youngest heads of state on the continent, but his eyes carried the weight of someone who had witnessed far more than his years should have allowed. The harsh fluorescent light above flickered intermittently, casting dancing shadows across the handwritten letter he held, a letter that would soon prove to be the first domino in a chain of events that would expose the rot within his own military establishment. The letter, written in the careful script of someone accustomed to secrecy, detailed a series of clandestine meetings that had taken place over the past week. Foreign attaches, military officers, and mysterious briefcases changing hands in the dead of night. As Traoré read and reread the intelligence report, his face remained impassive, but his mind raced through possibilities, connections, and inevitable confrontation that was approaching like a storm on the horizon. His morning ritual of bitter tea and contemplative silence was interrupted by the sound of heavy boots on marble. The irony wasn't lost on him. Here he was, a man who had come to power through his own military background, now potentially facing betrayal from the very institution that had shaped him. The knock on his door came precisely at 8:30, as if choreographed by someone who believed punctuality would lend legitimacy to treachery. "Sir," came the voice of his aide, a young soldier whose loyalty had never been questioned. "General Douamba is here. He didn't schedule an appointment, sir. He just arrived with a full security detail and demanded to see you immediately." Traoré set down his teacup with deliberate care, the small ceramic sound echoing in the quiet room like a gunshot. He had been expecting this moment for exactly 48 hours, ever since the coded message had arrived through channels that bypassed normal military communications. The message had been brief but chilling: movement detected. General Douamba has held 3 closed-door meetings with French attaches in the past week, requesting emergency clearance to investigate. Instead of panicking, instead of calling emergency security meetings or alerting international allies, Traoré had done something that would have surprised anyone who didn't truly know him. He had smiled. Not the smile of someone naive about the danger he faced, but the smile of someone who understood that, in the game of power, patience was often the most devastating weapon. "Tell the general I'll see him," Traoré said quietly, straightening his simple khaki uniform, but not with a security detail. This is a conversation between 2 men, not 2 armies. The aide hesitated, clearly uncomfortable with the implications of what was unfolding. "Sir, are you certain? Perhaps we should..." "Just him," Traoré repeated, his voice carrying the quiet authority that had made him beloved by his people and feared by his enemies. "And make sure the recording equipment in my office is functioning properly. We may want to remember every word of what's about to be said." Minutes later, the office door opened to admit General Madu Douamba, a man whose very presence seemed to demand attention and respect. At 52, Douamba was a throwback to an earlier era of African military leadership. Tall, imposing, with a chest full of medals that caught the light as he moved. His uniform was pressed to perfection, his boots polished to a mirror shine, and his bearing carried the confidence of someone who had never been denied anything he truly wanted. But there was something different about him today, something Traoré noticed immediately. Behind the swagger and the theatrical entrance, there was a tension in Douamba's shoulders, a slight tremor in his hands that suggested this confrontation was as much a test of his own resolve as it was an attempt to intimidate the president. "Mr. President," Douamba said, his voice carrying the formal tone of military protocol but lacking the respect that such protocol typically demanded, "I'm here on official business. Business that cannot wait for the usual diplomatic niceties." Traoré gestured to the chair across from his desk, but remained standing himself. "Please, General, sit. We have much to discuss. I imagine." Douamba remained standing as well, and from his briefcase, he withdrew a thick manila folder that he dropped onto Trist's desk with theatrical flair. The sound of paper hitting would seem to reverberate through the room like a judge's gavel. "I'm here to relieve you of your duties as President of Burkina Faso, effective immediately," Douamba announced, his voice gaining strength as he spoke the words he had clearly rehearsed. "The military council has lost confidence in your leadership, and we have determined that a transitional government is necessary for the stability of our nation." The folder contained an impressive array of documents, official-looking papers with elaborate seals, what appeared to be signatures from various military commanders, letters of support from unnamed international partners, and at the top of the pile, a proclamation printed on heavy paper that declared transitional power assumed by General Madu Douamba, chairman of the Committee for National Salvation. Traoré picked up the folder and began leafing through its contents with the casual interest of someone browsing a magazine. His silence stretched on for what felt like minutes, though it was probably only seconds. When he finally spoke, his voice was so quiet that Douamba had to lean forward to hear him. "Do you know what dignity tastes like, General?" The question was so unexpected that Douamba blinked in confusion. "What?" "Dignity," Traoré repeated, still not looking up from the papers. "It's a flavor most people never experience. It tastes like silence, not the silence of cowardice, but the silence that comes before thunder. The silence of a man who knows that truth is more powerful than any document you can forge." Douamba's confidence faltered for just a moment before reasserting itself with renewed aggression. "Your philosophical musings won't save you, Traoré. In 2 hours, the national radio will broadcast the announcement of the transitional government. Your supporters will be given the choice." It was then that Traoré looked up from the documents, and when he did, there was something in his eyes that made Douamba take an involuntary step backward. It wasn't anger or fear. It was something far more dangerous. It was a look of someone who knew something others didn't, someone who had been playing a different game entirely, while everyone else was still learning the rules. "That's interesting," Traoré said, walking slowly to the window that overlooked the palace courtyard. "Because about 20 minutes ago, I authorized the release of some rather interesting audio recordings to our national media. Recordings that I think the people of Burkina Faso will find quite illuminating." The color drained from Douamba's face as the implications of Traoré's words sank in. "What recordings?" Traoré turned back to face him, and now there was no mistaking the steel in his voice. "The recordings of your conversations with French intelligence operatives. The discussions about removing a leader who was too idealistic and too difficult to control. The planning sessions where you discuss which mining concessions you would award to your foreign backers once you assume power." As if summoned by some invisible signal, the sound of radio broadcasts began filtering in from the streets outside. Car radios, shopkeepers' radios, the portable radios carried by street vendors, all suddenly tuned to the same frequency, broadcasting the same devastating audio that would change everything. The voice on the radio was unmistakably General Douamba's, recorded during what he believed to be a private conversation in a secure location. "Traoré is too clean, too idealistic for our purposes," the general's voice declared. "The man actually believes in serving his people rather than serving our interests. We need someone more flexible, someone who understands that progress requires compromise, even if that compromise involves temporarily setting aside certain democratic principles. But wait, there's more. What would you do if you discovered that the person you trusted with your nation's security was selling that trust to the highest bidder? Comment below and let us know your thoughts. The second recording was even more damaging. The mining rights alone will generate enough revenue to ensure our long-term partnership. The French are particularly interested in the lithium deposits in the north. Once we have political stability, meaning once we have a compliant government, we can begin the extraction process that will benefit all parties involved. Outside the palace, the streets of Ouagadougou were erupting in a way that hadn't been seen since the revolution that had brought Traoré to power. The sound of car horns, shouting voices, and the rhythmic chanting of Traoré, Traoré, not a puppet, not a puppet, echoed to the palace walls like a judgment from the people themselves. Inside the office, General Douamba had sunk into the chair he had previously refused, his carefully maintained composure crumbling like a poorly constructed facade. The medals on his chest, which had once been symbols of honor and service, now seemed to weigh him down like shackles. "You don't understand," Douamba stammered, his voice barely above a whisper. "The economic pressures, the international situation. Sometimes leaders have to make difficult choices. Sometimes compromise is necessary for the greater good." Traoré walked slowly back to his desk, his movements deliberate and measured. "Compromise? Is that what we're calling treason now? Because what I heard in those recordings wasn't compromise. It was the sound of a man selling his country's future for personal gain." The president picked up the phone on his desk and dialed a number that Douamba recognized. The direct line to the military police. "This is President Traoré. Please send 2 officers to my office immediately. We have a situation that requires immediate attention." As they waited for the military police to arrive, Traoré continued speaking, his voice growing stronger with each word. "You walked into this office thinking you were untouchable, thinking that power was something you could simply take because you had the right connections and the right documents. But you made a fundamental mistake, General. You forgot that in a democracy, power doesn't belong to the strongest or the most connected. It belongs to the people." The sound of approaching footsteps in the hallway signaled the arrival of the military police, but Traoré wasn't finished. "You thought you could humiliate me, remove me from office like I was some kind of obstacle to be cleared away. But instead, you've humiliated yourself in front of the entire nation. You've exposed yourself as exactly the kind of leader our people fought so hard to remove from power." The door opened to admit 2 military police officers, their faces stern and professional. They had clearly heard the radio broadcasts, and their expressions suggested they understood the gravity of the situation they were walking into. "Officers," Traoré said formally, "General Douamba is under arrest for conspiracy against the state, treason, and collaboration with foreign powers against the interests of Burkina Faso. Please escort him from this building and ensure that he is processed according to military law." As the handcuffs clicked around Douamba's wrists, the general who had entered the office with such confidence just 30 minutes earlier now appeared as what he truly was: a broken man whose ambitions had exceeded his character, whose greed had overcome his patriotism. But the real drama was just beginning. Outside the palace, word had spread faster than wildfire through the crowded streets of Ouagadougou. Market vendors had closed their stalls, office workers had abandoned their desks, and students had poured out of classrooms. They came on foot, on motorcycles, in crowded cars and buses, all converging on the presidential palace to witness what many would later describe as a moment of national catharsis. The crowd that had gathered was unlike anything the city had seen in recent memory. There were elderly women who remembered the colonial era, young men who had grown up during the years of political instability, and children who had known only the promise of a better future under Traoré's leadership. They came from every neighborhood, every social class, every ethnic group, united by a shared understanding that they were witnessing something historic. When the palace doors opened and General Douamba emerged, flanked by military police officers, the crowd's reaction was immediate and visceral. This was the man who had tried to steal their voice, who had been willing to sell their resources to foreign powers for personal gain. The sight of him in handcuffs, his head hanging in shame, his confident swagger replaced by the shuffling gait of a defeated man, sent a wave of vindication through the assembled masses. an elderly woman, her back bent with age but her voice strong with righteous anger, stepped forward from the crowd. "Shame!" she called out, her words cutting through the air like a blade. "Shame on you for trying to sell our children's future." Others took up the cry, and soon the entire crowd was chanting in unison, their voices creating a thunderous roar that seemed to shake the very foundations of the palace. But perhaps the most powerful moment came when a young child, no more than 8 or 9 years old, broke free from his mother's grip and ran toward the police convoy. In his small hands, he carried a hastily made sign that the simplicity of the message, the innocence of the messenger, seemed to encapsulate everything the crowd was feeling. As the police vehicle carrying Duamba disappeared into the maze of city streets, the crowd didn't disperse. Instead, they began to celebrate. Street musicians appeared as if from nowhere, their drums and traditional instruments creating a rhythm that seemed to pulse with the heartbeat of the nation. Vendors began distributing food and water freely, understanding that this was not a day for profit, but for community. The celebration continued long into the night, but it wasn't just a party. It was a reaffirmation of values that many had feared were lost forever. People who had never spoken to each other before found themselves sharing stories about what this moment meant to them. Children who had grown up hearing tales of past coups and military takeovers now had a different story to tell. The story of how democracy defended itself, not with violence, but with truth. Inside the palace, Traoré watched the celebration from his office window, but his expression was thoughtful rather than triumphant. He understood that this victory, as satisfying as it was, represented more than just the defeat of one corrupt general. It was a message to anyone else who might be contemplating similar betrayals, a demonstration that the people of Burkina Faso were no longer willing to be passive observers of their own governance. His phone rang constantly throughout the evening. Calls from international leaders congratulating him on his handling of the crisis, from journalists seeking exclusive interviews, from fellow African presidents who wanted to understand how he had managed to turn potential disaster into such a decisive victory. But the call that meant the most to him came from a teacher in a rural village hundreds of miles from the capital. "Mr. President," the teacher said, her voice crackling through the poor connection, "my students want you to know that they listened to the radio today. They want you to know that they understand what happened, and they're proud to be citizens of Burkina Faso." It was a reminder that the true measure of this day's events wouldn't be found in newspaper headlines or international diplomatic cables, but in the hearts and minds of ordinary people who had been reminded that their voices mattered, that their leaders could be held accountable, and that justice didn't always require violence to prevail. The following morning brought a different kind of reckoning. General Duamba, sitting in a military detention facility, was stripped of his rank and decorations in a ceremony that was broadcast live on national television. The medals that had once been symbols of his service and authority were removed one by one, each removal accompanied by a reading of the specific charges against him. But perhaps more devastating than the loss of his rank was a revelation of just how thoroughly his conspiracy had been penetrated by Traoré's intelligence services. The president, in a national address that evening, revealed that the investigation into Duamba's activities had been ongoing for months, that every meeting with foreign agents had been monitored, every communication intercepted, every document cataloged. "We allowed General Duamba to believe that his conspiracy was secret," Traoré explained to the nation, "not because we were weak, but because we wanted to understand the full extent of the threat we faced. We wanted to identify not just a leader of this conspiracy, but every person who was willing to participate in it, every foreign power that was willing to support it, every institution that was willing to be corrupted by it." The revelations that followed painted a picture of corruption that went far beyond one ambitious general. Bank accounts in foreign countries, real estate purchases that far exceeded any legitimate military salary, communications with intelligence services from multiple countries, and, perhaps most damaging of all, evidence that Duamba had been preparing to award mineral extraction rights to foreign companies in exchange for their support of his coup. But even as the full scope of the conspiracy was revealed, Traoré's response remained measured and focused on the future rather than revenge. The conspirators would face justice through the legal system, but there would be no mass purges, no wholesale restructuring of the military, no descent into the kind of paranoid authoritarianism that had characterized so many African governments facing similar challenges. Instead, The president announced a series of reforms designed to strengthen democratic institutions and prevent future conspiracies. Military officers would be required to undergo regular ethics training. Financial disclosure requirements would be expanded and more rigorously enforced. Communication with foreign officials would be subject to greater oversight and transparency requirements. More importantly, the president announced the creation of a new civic education program that would be mandatory for all citizens, from school children to government officials. The program would focus on the principles of democratic governance, the rights and responsibilities of citizenship, and the importance of vigilance in protecting democratic institutions from those who would abuse them. What do you think? Was Traoré's response too lenient, or was his focus on education and institutional reform the right approach? Let us know in the comments what you would have done in his position. The international reaction to the events in Burkina Faso was swift and largely positive. Democratic governments around the world praised Traoré's handling of the crisis, noting that he had managed to defend his government without resorting to violence or abandoning democratic principles. Several countries announced increased aid and investment packages, recognizing that supporting stable democratic governments in West Africa was essential to regional security and prosperity. But perhaps the most significant international reaction came from France, the former colonial power whose agents had been implicated in the conspiracy. In a rare public statement, the French government distanced itself from the activities of its intelligence operatives, claiming that they had been acting without authorization and would face appropriate consequences. The statement was widely seen as an attempt at damage control, but also represented a broader recognition that the old patterns of post-colonial manipulation were becoming increasingly untenable. Young African leaders like Traoré were no longer willing to accept the kind of foreign interference that had characterized the continent's politics for decades after independence. As the weeks passed and the immediate crisis faded from the headlines, the deeper implications of what had happened began to emerge. Other African countries began implementing similar transparency measures, recognizing that corruption and foreign manipulation were vulnerabilities that needed to be addressed proactively rather than reactively. Regional organizations strengthened their democratic governance protocols, and there was a noticeable increase in cooperation between African intelligence services aimed at identifying and preventing foreign interference in domestic politics. The events in Burkina Faso had become a template for how democratic governments could defend themselves against internal and external threats while maintaining their commitment to human rights and the rule of law. The experience of witnessing their democratic institutions successfully defend themselves against a serious threat had created a sense of national pride and civic engagement that was unprecedented in the country's modern history. Voter registration increased dramatically in the months following the crisis, as citizens who had previously felt disconnected from the political process began to understand the importance of their participation. Community organizations focused on civic education and government oversight proliferated, creating a network of grassroots democratic accountability that would serve as an additional layer of protection against future threats. The story of how President Ibrahim Traoré humiliated General Douamba became more than just a political anecdote. It became a national legend, a story that parents told their children about the importance of integrity and the power of truth. It was a reminder that, in the contest between dignity and deception, between service and self-interest, between democracy and authoritarianism, the outcome was not predetermined. Victory belonged to those who had the courage to stand for their principles, the wisdom to prepare for challenges, and the patience to allow truth to emerge in its own time. It belonged to those who understood that real power came not from the ability to intimidate or manipulate, but from the trust and respect of the people they serve. As the sun set over Ouagadougou on that historic day, casting long shadows across the palace courtyard where citizens continued to celebrate late into the night, the message was clear: democracy, when defended with intelligence and integrity, was stronger than any conspiracy, more powerful than any foreign interference, and more enduring than any individual leader's ambitions. The general had thought he was invincible, but he had learned the hard way that, in the end, the people's voice would always be stronger than any backroom deal, any foreign promise, or any medal on a corrupt man's chest. This is what happens when dignity meets deception, and dignity doesn't just win. It humiliates those who thought they could steal what belongs to the people. The aftermath of General Douamba's spectacular downfall sent shockwaves throughout the West African region that would reverberate for months to come. Intelligence agencies across the continent began conducting their own internal reviews, suddenly aware that if such an elaborate conspiracy could be uncovered and dismantled in Burkina Faso, similar networks might be operating within their own borders. The method by which Traoré had allowed the conspiracy to fully develop before striking had become a case study in intelligence warfare, demonstrating that sometimes the most effective defense was to let your enemies reveal themselves completely before moving against them. 3 days after Douamba's arrest, as investigators continued to unravel the full extent of conspiracy, a second wave of revelations emerged that would prove even more damaging to those who had supported the failed coup attempt. Hidden within the encrypted communications that had been intercepted over the previous months were detailed financial records showing a web of corruption that extended far beyond a simple military conspiracy into highest levels of international business and diplomacy. The records revealed that Douamba's handlers had promised him not just political power, but personal wealth that would have made him one of the richest men in West Africa. Swiss bank accounts had been established in his name. Luxury properties in European capitals had been purchased as safe houses for his eventual exile. And, most shocking of all, a detailed plan had been developed for the systematic exploitation of Burkina Faso's natural resources that would have generated billions in profits for foreign corporations while leaving the Burkinabe people with nothing but environmental devastation. President Traoré, reviewing these documents in his office as the morning sun streamed through windows that had witnessed so much history over the past week, felt a mixture of vindication and disgust. The vindication came from knowing that his patient approach had allowed them to uncover not just the immediate threat, but the entire network that had supported it. The disgust came from seeing, in black and white, just how thoroughly some people were willing to sell out their own country for personal gain. But what struck him most profoundly was a series of psychological profiles that had been prepared by foreign intelligence services. Profiles that analyzed his own personality and leadership style with clinical precision. The documents revealed that his enemies had studied him for years, identified what they believed were his weaknesses and vulnerabilities. They had concluded that his idealism would make him predictable, that his attachment to democratic principles would prevent him from taking decisive action against threats, and that his youth and inexperience would make him easy to manipulate or remove. The irony was not lost on him that these supposed weaknesses had actually been his greatest strengths. His idealism had kept him focused on serving his people rather than himself. His attachment to democratic principles had ensured that he maintained the moral authority necessary to expose the conspiracy, and his youth had given him the energy and adaptability to outmaneuver opponents who had underestimated him based on their own cynical assumptions about power and leadership. As he prepared for what would become known as his Address to the Conscience of Africa, a speech that would be broadcast throughout the continent and beyond, Traoré reflected on the broader implications of what had been uncovered. This wasn't just about one failed coup in one small West African country. This was about a pattern of foreign interference and domestic corruption that had plagued the continent for decades, a pattern that could only be broken through transparency, accountability, and the kind of moral courage that too many leaders have been unwilling to display. The presidential palace's main hall had been converted into a television studio for the occasion, with cameras positioned to capture not just the president's words, but the symbolic elements that surrounded him. The flag of Burkina Faso, portraits of the country's independence heroes, and most importantly, a collection of traditional artifacts that represented the deep cultural roots that no amount of foreign manipulation could sever. When Traoré began speaking that evening, his voice carried a gravity that made it clear this was not just another political address, but a historical moment that would be remembered long after all the participants had passed from the scene. My fellow Africans, he began, deliberately addressing not just his own citizens, but the entire continent. What we have witnessed this week is not just a failure of one conspiracy, but the exposure of a system of exploitation that has operated in the shadows for far too long. The documents we have recovered reveal not just the ambitions of General Douamba, but the methods by which foreign powers have sought to maintain control over our resources, our governments, and our futures. He paused, allowing the weight of his words to settle before continuing. These documents show us that our enemies do not see us as equals to be respected, but as children to be manipulated. They do not see our resources as belonging to our people, but as prizes to be claimed by whoever can install the most compliant government. They do not see our democracy as a legitimate expression of our people's will, The speech continued for nearly an hour, methodically laying out the evidence that had been gathered, but more importantly, articulating a vision for how African nations could protect themselves against such interference in the future. He spoke of the need for greater regional cooperation, for intelligence sharing between democratic governments, for economic partnerships that served African interests rather than exploiting African resources. But perhaps the most powerful moment came when he directly addressed a question that many viewers were undoubtedly asking themselves. How could they know if similar conspiracies were operating in their own countries? The signs are always there, Traoré explained, his voice taking on the tone of a teacher rather than a politician. When military officers begin living beyond their means, when government officials develop sudden friendships with foreign businessmen, when policy decisions seem to serve external interests rather than national ones, these are the warning signs that every citizen must learn to recognize. He went on to announce the creation of what he called the African Democratic Defense Initiative, a continental network of civil society organizations, journalists, and government officials dedicated to identifying and exposing foreign interference in African politics. The initiative would provide training in investigative techniques, secure communication methods, and legal strategies for those brave enough to take on powerful interests. So, what's your take on this? Do you think African nations can really break free from decades of foreign manipulation, or are the external forces too powerful? Share your thoughts in the comments. We want to know what you think about this continental awakening. The response to Traoré's address was immediate and overwhelming. Within hours, similar movements began emerging across the continent. In Ghana, a group of journalists announced they were launching an investigation into Chinese infrastructure deals that seemed to favor foreign workers over local employment. In Kenya, civil society organizations began demanding greater transparency in mineral extraction agreements. In Nigeria, student groups organized protests calling for the renegotiation of oil contracts that had been signed during previous military governments. But the most significant response came from an unexpected source. General Douamba himself, from his prison cell. The disgraced former military leader agreed to cooperate fully with investigators, apparently having realized that his foreign handlers had abandoned him the moment his usefulness had ended. His detailed confessions would eventually fill over 1,000 pages, providing an insider's view of how foreign intelligence services recruited and managed their African assets. The confessions revealed a world of elaborate psychological manipulation, where ambitious military officers were gradually compromised through a combination of flattery, financial incentives, and carefully staged coincidences that made them feel like they were the architects of their own rise to power. Douamba described how he had been approached initially through seemingly innocent social contacts, a dinner invitation from a cultural attaché, a chance meeting at an international conference, an offer to provide consulting services to foreign companies interested in African markets. Each interaction had been designed to build trust and dependency while gathering intelligence about his personality, his ambitions, his fears, and his weaknesses. By the time he realized he was being manipulated, he was already so deeply compromised that he felt he had no choice but to continue cooperating with his handlers' increasingly ambitious plans. The psychological profile that emerged from these confessions was that of a man who had convinced himself that he was serving his country's interests, even as he betrayed them. His handlers have been expert at providing justifications for each step of the conspiracy, framing the eventual coup as a necessary intervention to save Burkina Faso from the chaos of democratic governance and the inexperience of its young president. Most chilling of all was Douamba's description of the celebration that his foreign contacts had planned for the day after the coup's success. A luxury hotel in Paris had been booked for what was euphemistically described as a transitional governance conference, where the new government's policies would be outlined by foreign advisors who had never set foot in Burkina Faso, but who had already divided up the country's resources among their corporate sponsors. The revelation of these plans sent a fresh wave of outrage through Burkina Faso and beyond. The idea that foreign powers had been so confident of success that they had already planned the celebration of their puppet government's installation was seen as the ultimate insult to African sovereignty and dignity. President Traoré, reviewing these confessions in his office late one evening, found himself feeling something he hadn't expected: pity for General Douamba. The man who had walked into the same office just weeks earlier with such arrogance and certainty now appeared in his testimony as a victim of his own ambitions, manipulated by handlers who had understood his psychology better than he had understood it himself. But this moment of pity was quickly replaced by a deeper anger at the system that had created such vulnerabilities in the first place. How many other African leaders, past and present, had been similarly manipulated? How many coups, how many policy decisions, how many economic agreements have been the result not of African choices, but of foreign manipulation operating behind the scenes? The question led to the creation of what historians would later call the Ouagadougou process, a systematic review of political and economic decisions made by African governments over previous decades, aimed at identifying patterns of foreign influence and developing strategies to prevent such manipulation in the future. The process began with Burkina Faso's own history, examining every major policy decision made since independence to determine which had served genuine national interests and which had primarily benefited foreign powers. The results were sobering. A clear pattern emerged of economic policies that had consistently favored foreign extraction companies over local development, military agreements that had served foreign strategic interests rather than national security needs, and political alliances that had isolated African countries from their neighbors while binding them more closely to former colonial powers. But the Ouagadougou process was not just about identifying past mistakes. It was about creating a framework for making better decisions in the future. Teams of economists, political scientists, and policy analysts worked to develop what they called sovereignty impact assessments, detailed analyses that would be required for any major policy decision, measuring not just economic costs and benefits, but also the long-term implications for national independence and self-determination. The first major test of this new framework came sooner than anyone had expected. Just 2 months after General Douamba's arrest, a consortium of international mining companies approached the Burkina Faso government with an offer that, on the surface, appeared to be exactly what the country needed: a multi-billion-dollar investment in lithium extraction that would create thousands of jobs and generate substantial government revenues. Previous governments might have jumped at such an opportunity, especially given the country's ongoing development needs and the international pressure to attract foreign investment. But the new sovereignty impact assessment process, the proposed contract, would have given the foreign companies extensive control over not just the mining sites, but also the surrounding infrastructure, including roads, power generation, and even local governance structures. The employment promises, while impressive in raw numbers, were heavily skewed toward foreign technical specialists, with local workers relegated to low-skill positions with minimal training opportunities. Most concerning of all, the environmental and social impact assessments provided by the companies had been prepared by consulting firms with documented histories of underestimating the long-term costs of extraction projects, particularly in African contexts where regulatory oversight was traditionally weak. After months of careful analysis and public consultation, a process that itself sent a message about the new standards of transparency that would govern such decisions, the Burkina Faso government announced its decision to reject the proposed contract in favor of a different approach entirely. Instead of selling extraction rights to foreign companies, the government would develop the lithium deposits through a combination of state-owned enterprises and partnerships with other African countries that had experience in mineral processing. The project would take longer to implement and would require more upfront investment from the government, but would ensure that the benefits of the country's natural resources would remain in African hands. The announcement sent shockwaves through international business circles, where it was seen as a dangerous precedent that could spread to other resource-rich African countries. Editorial pages in major Western newspapers warned of the risks of resource nationalism and the potential for reduced foreign investment throughout the continent. But the response from ordinary Africans was overwhelmingly positive. Here, finally, was evidence that the lessons of the Douamba conspiracy were being applied in practical ways, that the commitment to sovereignty and self-determination was more than just political rhetoric. Think about this for a moment. If you were in charge of a resource-rich country, would you choose the quick profits from foreign deals or the longer, harder path of developing those resources yourself? What would your decision be based on? Let us know in the comments what factors would influence your choice. The success of Burkina Faso's new approach began attracting attention from other African leaders who were facing similar decisions about resource extraction and foreign investment. A series of summits and conferences brought together government officials, civil society leaders, and academic experts to share experiences and develop common strategies for protecting African interests while still participating in the global economy. These gatherings revealed that the manipulation techniques used against General Douamba were far from unique. Similar patterns of recruitment, compromise, and control had been employed across the continent, often with devastating results for the countries and peoples involved. But they also revealed that there were success stories, leaders who had resisted such manipulation, policies that had genuinely served national interests, and communities that had found ways to benefit from international engagement without sacrificing their autonomy. One of the most powerful testimonies came from a former Nigerian oil minister who described how he had been approached by representatives of major petroleum companies with offers that seemed too good to refuse. The companies had promised not just immediate revenues, but also technology transfers, job training programs, and environmental protection measures that would set new standards for the industry. But careful analysis of the proposed contracts revealed that the technology transfers were limited to outdated equipment that the companies were already planning to phase out. The job training programs were designed to create dependency rather than genuine expertise, and the environmental protection measures contained loopholes that would have allowed significant ecological damage while providing legal cover for the companies involved. The minister's decision to reject these offers and instead negotiate a more equitable arrangement had initially been criticized by international observers as short-sighted and economically naive. But over time, as other countries that had accepted similar deals experienced the environmental and economic consequences that the Nigerian government had avoided, his decision was increasingly seen as an example of the kind of long-term thinking that African leadership required. These stories of resistance and success provided both inspiration and practical guidance for other leaders facing similar pressures. They demonstrated that it was possible to maintain positive relationships with international partners while still protecting national interests, that economic development didn't require surrendering sovereignty, and that the short-term costs of rejecting exploitative deals were far outweighed by the long-term benefits of maintaining control over national resources and decision-making processes. The network that grew out of these exchanges became known as the Sovereignty Alliance, not a formal organization with treaties and bureaucratic structures, but a loose confederation of leaders, activists, and intellectuals committed to supporting each other in the ongoing struggle to maintain African independence and self-determination. The alliance's influence became evident in a series of policy decisions across the continent. Over the following months, Chad renegotiated its oil revenue-sharing agreements to ensure greater benefits for local communities. Tanzania restructured its mining regulations to require greater local participation in extraction projects. Ghana implemented new transparency requirements for foreign investment that made it much more difficult for companies to hide the true costs and benefits of the proposed projects. But perhaps the most significant victory came in a country where few would have expected it: the Democratic Republic of Congo, whose vast mineral wealth had made it a target for exploitation by multiple foreign powers for decades. Inspired by the example of Burkina Faso and supported by the technical expertise developed through the Sovereignty Alliance, the Congolese government announced a comprehensive review of all existing mining contracts. The review process took nearly 2 years and faced enormous pressure from international mining companies, foreign governments, and even some international financial institutions that threatened economic retaliation if the contracts were significantly altered. But the Congolese government, backed by popular support and technical assistance from alliance partners, persevered through pressure and ultimately succeeded in restructuring the agreements in ways that doubled government revenues while significantly increasing local employment and technology transfer requirements. The success in Congo sent a message throughout Africa and beyond that the days of resource extraction on terms dictated entirely by foreign companies were coming to an end. More importantly, it demonstrated that even countries with limited bargaining power could achieve more equitable arrangements when they had access to the kind of technical expertise and moral support that the Sovereign Alliance provided. As President Traoré reflected on these developments from his office in Ouagadougou, now 2 years after the failed coup attempt that had started this continental awakening, he was struck by how much had changed and how much further there was still to go. The immediate crisis had been resolved. The conspiracy had been exposed, and the conspirators had faced justice. But the deeper work of building truly independent and sovereign African states was a generational project that would require sustained commitment from leaders and citizens alike. The morning sun, streaming through his office windows, illuminated a very different scene than the one that had existed during those tense moments when General Douamba had tried to intimidate him into surrendering power. The walls now displayed maps showing the progress of sovereignty initiatives across the continent, photographs from alliance summits and conferences, and letters from citizens expressing their support for the new direction that African leadership was taking. But most importantly, there was a new sense of possibility in the air, a feeling that the future could be different from the past, that African countries could chart their own course in the world without constantly looking over their shoulders for the approval or disapproval of former colonial powers. The story of how President Ibrahim Traoré had humiliated General Douamba had become more than just a political anecdote. It had become a symbol of a new kind of African leadership, one that combined moral courage with strategic intelligence, one that understood that true strength came not from military force or foreign backing, but from the trust and support of one's own people. And as the sun set over Ouagadougou that evening, casting long shadows across a city that had witnessed so much history and was now making history of its own, the message was clearer than ever. The age of manipulation and exploitation was ending, and the age of true African independence was finally beginning. This is what happens when dignity confronts deception, when truth challenges power, when the people's voice rises above the whispers of those who would sell their birthright for temporary gain. The general thought he was invincible. Let us know in the comments below. And don't forget to subscribe for more incredible stories about justice and comeback victories that will restore your faith in standing up for what's right.